So, Asha, are courts going to be able to stop Trump from using the military to take over our cities?
Eh, it's complicated. I'm Asha Rengappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm the author of the Freedom Academy Substack.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a speech.
Wow, well, this is an incredibly complicated topic, Asha. There's so much here, so many different states really to talk about, from California to Oregon to now my home state of Illinois, sadly.
Yeah.
Yes. Maybe we should start with California.
So let's start with California. Trump, it was back in September, federalized the National Guard, arguing that he was unable to execute the laws with regular forces, which is what the statute requires, 10 U.S.C. 12406. Basically, he was saying that he was unable to execute immigration laws because of the protests, et cetera. And he federalized the California National Guard in order to assist with that, basically to act in a protective capacity, I guess, to protect federal property and federal officials. And then he also deployed some Marines into the city as well.
Well, that's a lot less controversial, obviously, than using them to conduct policing operations, because the constitutional structure in the United States has always been that the states have police power, not the federal government. Of course, it's still problematic in its own way to have federal troops patrolling, particularly when there's no specific threat or specific circumstance that would warrant that, right? And there, as a result, of course, there has been some real escalation in California, and it really looked like for a while that Trump was going to be focusing his ire there.
Yeah, and the courts there, so they litigated his federalization of the National Guard. That was upheld by the Ninth Circuit, which was willing to defer to Trump's determination that he couldn't enforce the law with regular forces. But they did litigate the issue of whether the federalized troops and or the Marines had violated the Posse Comitatus Act, because the important thing here is even after Trump federalizes the troops under a statute called the 10 USC 12406, they are still bound by, as is the regular military, the Posse Comitatus Act, which prevents them from engaging in regular law enforcement functions. And so this entails anything from crowd and riot control to detaining or arresting people. They cannot do that unless Trump invokes the Insurrection Act, which he has not done yet in any of these states. And we'll come back to that, because I think that there are some important points to make with regard to what would be required for him to invoke that.
Right. So now, I mean, moving on a little bit to, because he's rolling this out as basically it's like a nationwide tour. He keeps mentioning different cities and different states. So, he of course now has turned his ire to Oregon, which he falsely has been claiming is, Portland is burning to the ground, which is, I think, a demonstrably false statement. And in there, in Oregon, a United States district judge issued a temporary restraining order. Just on Saturday, October the 4th, blocking the administration from deploying the Oregon National Guard to Portland. And instead of just appealing that and dealing with the courts in the way that you would expect the executive branch to do, ultimately Trump tried to get around that. Within hours, the Pentagon says, okay, we are reassigning 200 federalized California National Guard troops to Portland instead.
Yeah, so let's unpack that. So yes, Trump tried to, do a repeat of what he did in California by federalizing the Oregon National Guard. And this was quite extraordinary because the district judge that is overseeing that case, Karen Immergut, is a Trump appointee. This is a conservative judge, a Trump appointee. Her order is really, I think, a really great framing of this issue, because she basically says that this entire thing, this federalization, the way that the National Guard is being used, presents three different kinds of issues. There is the federalism issue, which is about what is the relationship between the federal government and the states. There's the issue of what the relationship is between the military and domestic law enforcement. And then there's the issue of what is the relationship between Congress and the president, because all of this is happening under delegated statutory authority. And I thought that was a really brilliant framing, because I think part of the reason that this is so complicated is that you have these multiple different tensions happening all at once. What was very noteworthy, Renato, about her order is that she reviewed all of the factual claims that were made by the Trump administration. And she said, listen, there was a period of, violent activity in June. But then that stopped. And basically, since then, there have been these sporadic, instances of violence, but it has all been things that the state and local police can handle. And she says, so this idea that the Trump administration is unable to enforce the law with regular forces, she found to be factually untrue. In other words, the actual basis for being able to utilize this statute, 10 U.S.C. 12406, she found was just not in existence. And I just want to read this out because it's actually quite extraordinary. She says, in sum, the president is certainly entitled a great level of deference in his determination that he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. But a great level of deference is not equivalent to ignoring the facts on the ground. As the Ninth Circuit articulated, courts must review the president's determination to ensure that it reflects a colorable assessment of the facts and law within a range of honest judgment. Here, this court concludes that the president did not have a colorable basis to invoke Section 12406 to federalize the National Guard, because the situation on the ground belied an inability of federal law enforcement officers to execute federal law. The president's determination was simply untethered to the facts. Mic drop.
Quite remarkable. Yeah, it's really remarkable.
That is an extraordinary thing for a judge to say in this kind of context, because, and let's leave aside that this is a conservative judge. I know that we're all conditioned that Trump-appointed judges are going to rule for Trump and Biden-appointed judges are going to, she's acting as a judge. She's looking at the facts on the ground. The president is traditionally, particularly when it comes to things like national security, the military, also, as we've mentioned before, foreign affairs, and we'll get to that also in the next segment, courts don't typically second guess the president. And even the Ninth Circuit was unwilling to second guess. They said, listen, unless we see that is totally in bad faith, there is a colorable claim to be federalizing the troops in California. And at that time, there were actually, violent protests and stuff happening on the ground. So the court was like, okay. I think we're in this new era, Renato, where courts are kind of realizing that our existing frameworks of things like deferring to the executive branch on certain kinds of determination is really built on a presupposition that the actor is going to be operating, if not in good faith, truthfully, and that is not a presumption that courts can really maintain anymore. It's crazy. It is crazy that this is the signal that we're getting from the courts and even from conservative judges.
It's very challenging circumstance, Asha, because in other circumstances, right, if we think back to another time where there was a crisis in our country in 9/11, right, there's an attack on the country. The arguments were all being made for the expansion of executive power at that time. And there was a plausibility there. And the argument was, hey, the president has to act quickly. There's planes, if there's planes in the air and there's an attack, the president needs to be able to make snap decisions. It really shows a weakness and an issue with our system because we obviously want to have an executive who can act quickly in response to crises, threats, wars, invasions, attacks, etc. But if the courts can't rely on the executive to be truthful and there's no check on that, what do you do?
What do you do? And also, I think it reveals a gap in the way that many of our statutes are worded, which delegate authority to the president. Why discretion to be able to take certain actions if he determines that X, Y, and Z exists, right? Kind of leaving that factual determination to the president, and with huge powers, by the way, like powers to exclude people from the country, to federalize the National Guard. And so this does kind of reveal that it might be that we just need to rethink the entire system of how like these delegated authorities and discretion operate. But as you noted, she then enjoined the Trump administration from being able to federalize the Oregon National Guard. And so then he tried to do a workaround and tried to send the California Guard into Oregon.
Yeah, what I really want everyone to take away from that, or at least here's my takeaway. Instead of respecting the judge's order, in my mind, respecting the judge's order would be asking her to reconsider, for example, her order, seeking an appeal. What they basically did is they're like, how can we find a way around this? And how can we find, like, let's say, a way in which her order is drafted so narrowly that we can find a way to technically not violate it, but still do exactly what we want? And that's really what Trump was doing. She said that he couldn't federalize the Oregon National Guard. Okay, I had court say I could do that in California. I'm going to take those troops. I'm going to order them into Oregon. And what is she going to do about that? Right. Is essentially where this goes. And of course, she did do something about that on Sunday during an emergency hearing. She expanded her restraining order. It's a short order that she wrote, but basically she said that he can't deploy the National Guard from any state to Oregon. And now that really puts Trump in a spot where, he has to go through this process. He can't do exactly what he wants. And now it looks like he's trying to find a workaround around that.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see whether he tries to just send in the regular military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If that's not covered. And I just want to point out that this echoes, just to kind of start connecting the dots on their behavior in court, this echoes what they did back in Washington, D.C. in Judge Boasberg's courtroom when he issued an order that the planes containing the migrants that were headed to El Salvador, turn around. And their argument was, well, he issued that order orally, not in writing, and the planes were already in the air. And in other words, they were taking this very pedantic, view of trying to find some loophole that they could argue that didn't compel them to obey it, even though I think, as you're pointing out in this case, any reasonable lawyer would understand that the implication of the order, given the facts before the court, would also include not being able to use another state's National Guard. Just like in that court, obviously a verbal order would still be as binding on the parties as a written order in terms of, turning the planes around.
Right. If this was, a dispute between, let's say, the state of Oregon and Asha Rengapa or Asha Corp or whatever, any ordinary person or ordinary company, they would not want to piss the judge off or run afoul of the judge. They wouldn't want to have a circumstance where the judge gets the sense that they're trying to get around her order. And that's exactly what happened here. I mean, I think that's exactly the impression that was left on the judge. That's why the judge expanded her order, which you would have to have anticipated that she would have done. I mean, another possibility, of course, is that he tries to declare an insurrection, invoke the Insurrection Act as another possibility to try to work around.
Yes. And I think that's why her order is so important in terms of the reasoning, because the Insurrection Act would also require, I'm going to pull up the text here, that also requires a factual determination that there is, let's see, so whenever the president considers, I'm quoting here from the Insurrection Act, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. And as I noted before, the Insurrection Act essentially allows the president to, it's an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. So what it would allow him to do is to be able to use the military for law enforcement. Then they would be able to do things like not just crowd control and riot control, but detain people and arrest people. They would be able to work hand in hand with local and state law enforcement. But if you'll notice, it still has this factual determination that there's unlawful obstructions, combinations, assemblages, or rebellion. And one of the things that the Oregon judge she discusses the argument that there's a rebellion, because the Trump administration tried to argue that as well. They said this is a rebellion. And she points out that the rebellion has to be not only violent, but also be armed and be against the authority of the United States. So in other words, I think, Renato, so this is my theory, there is a hope here that they can provoke a violent response. That's what I think they are waiting for. That we've been wondering why he hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act. I think because they don't want him to get shot down by a court, because it's just such a big deal to do that. And so if they can provoke a violent response from these protesters, then they have something to hang their hat on. And so I just think that is something to keep in mind on part of the reason why he's trying to escalate, so that then he can have the pretext to further escalate.
It reminds me of in the civil rights movement, where part of the point was, that, and part of the challenge that people who were engaging in sit-ins and marches and other nonviolent protests they knew that they could not respond. Because if they responded in a particular way to any provocation, that could be used against not only them, but their entire movement. And so here you have protesters, for example, or protesting action by ICE in this very challenging position in which they know that if they get outside of any kind of box, that they could potentially be a poster child that's used as Exhibit A by the Trump administration to expand their power. So it's a very challenging situation, but it's eerie. It really sounds like something. As a Star Wars fan, there's a series that's very popular right now that has parallels to this, in which the Empire tries to provoke violence, and it's by the rebels to try to have an excuse to, send in troops, and it's very prescient at this point that's where we are, and it's shocking that that's where we are as a country.
I agree. And I just want to drive home that point that I do think there is a meaningful difference. I mean, listen, it is bad. Don't get me wrong for there to be deployments of federal troops, but it is even worse if then they are authorized to be able to detain and arrest people along with ICE, which they are not doing right now. In fact, in California, district court, after litigating the issue of the Posse Comitatus Act, actually said they had violated that in California and enjoined even the federalized National Guard and the Marines from being able to engage in law enforcement functions. And the reason that it is a big deal is that once they do that, I think it is almost going to be impossible to rein back. Because once the government can say, hey, listen, there is a rebellion, there is an insurrection, they are like shooting at, ICE or whatever, somebody was harmed, somebody was killed. There's no, I don't know that at that point that any court is going to then second guess, at some point down the line. In other words, it's going to be kind of a constant state for a while, and it's going to expand even further. And I'm just saying this because I mentioned this whole idea of nonviolent protest on blue sky and said, that we're kind of, you invoke the civil rights movement. I was invoking Gandhi's nonviolent resistance and saying, this is the moment where the high ground is going to be making plain the administration's brutality for all to see without any question. Right? I mean, it's a terrible situation, but the minute that you give any kind of excuse, then it lets them off the hook. And I got so much pushback where people were like, no, violence is the only answer. And I'm like, you have no idea where this can go. And you're also doing the work of the administration for them if you engage in any kind of violent response. I'm sorry. That is just how it is. And the Supreme Court will rubber stamp it, and we will be basically in a military police state until, I don't know, whenever.
Well, violence is never the answer. And that was part of the wisdom of Gandhi and Dr. King and so forth. So I do not think that that's the case. And, we have had imagery, coming to, switching gears slightly to Illinois, which we had previewed earlier. There are some imagery that's been coming out of in video footage coming out of Illinois, which is shocking, in part because protesters have been nonviolent. I mean, there was, of course, a minister.
Yep, I saw that. The priest that was fired on with a paint gun or something.
Yeah, I think it was maybe a pepper gas bullet or something.
Yes, that's right.
That's something of that sort. But so it wasn't like he was shot with with a lethal force. But nonetheless, it's jarring to see.
He was shot in the head. I mean, that could have hit his eye. I mean, he could go blind.
Yeah, no, it's just. But I just think the imagery of seeing a man of God, who was there, being hit in the head with a firearm, it's jarring, and I do think it did make me think of the civil rights movement because, as you know, many members of the clergy were also involved in and participated in protests during the civil rights movement in solidarity with Black Americans who are fighting for their freedoms and for equal justice under the law.
There was also an incident is it Broadview is the area of Chicago, that a CBS reporter had some kind of pepper bullet shot into her car, into her truck, that then, clouded up. And she was a reporter. I mean, this is the press. She was driving towards the ICE facility. There was apparently no protesters there either. So again, I really think that the strategy here is to provoke a response, to provoke an uprising, to provoke violence. And then to be able to use that as an excuse to further escalate their own force.
That's right. And here in Illinois, the legal battle is just really getting started. On Monday, we are recording this on Wednesday the 8th, but on Monday, the state of Illinois brought a suit. The Illinois Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, brought a suit seeking to block the deployment. There obviously has also been, and I think if you're watching this on video or listening to this podcast, you are probably aware of Illinois elected officials have been standing in solidarity together, with the city of Chicago in defiance of this action. I mean, the governor's been calling it an invasion. Obviously, Trump has retaliated by saying that our governor, Governor Pritzker, and Mayor Johnson should be thrown in prison for unspecified, perhaps non-crimes, for expressing their views, expressing their opinion. But it's worth noting, a former colleague of mine, April Perry, who's now a judge. She was actually, I believe, the last judge who got through in the Biden administration. I was at her in her induction ceremony or whatever. She did not issue an emergency injunction, which allowed the deployment of 300 Illinois Guard troops and federalizing them, and then 400 Texas National Guard troops. I'm sure you may have seen images on social media regarding that, but it's not clear to me why. We don't have the transcript of why it is she made that determination, or we don't know exactly what her reasoning is. But it may be that it was moot at that point.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I would call it a fait accompli rather than moot, maybe. But I mean, I think there could be a couple of things going on. It could be that in Portland, it was so obviously not the case that anything rose to the level of an inability of regular federal forces to be able to enforce the law, that the judge was able to quickly make that factual determination for purposes of the temporary restraining order. Whereas in Chicago, maybe because there's just so much happening. I mean, we had the whole issue. There's also the raid on the apartment building. And in other words, because there's so much commotion, it could be that she is loath, again, go back to this deference issue, she's loath to second guess without maybe getting more information, because then to be overturned is like maybe a bigger blow, right? Then it's like validates this idea that you have these Democrat, Antifa judges or whatever that are trying to promote terrorism or something like that in the cities, or whatever Stephen Miller is accusing these judges of, including, by the way, the conservative Oregon judge who ruled against them. The other possibility is, as I mentioned, that it's a fait accompli, that at this point they're federalized, they're in there. I think by the time this got into her court, the Texas National Guard had already come in or something like that. And so I would be more alarmed at this possibility. But if the idea is, what if I order this and the Trump administration doesn't comply? And then it goes up to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court is like, oh, what if he doesn't comply? And we need, in other words, there's a kind of in my Russian disinformation class, we call this reflexive control, where it's like, you're making things, putting things in a condition that force the other party to arrive at a certain decision. That could be what's going on. And I think it's a situation where the executive branch kind of has a first mover advantage with these kinds of things. Courts are slow.
That's right. Look, I think that's a theme that we've had for years now, talking about how the courts work, whether it's in the criminal justice context, where we were talking about various matters, criminal indictments and investigations of Trump, but also, civil matters as well. They take time to work their way through the courts. I will note the Oregon judge, who you referred to earlier, she acted with really great speed, much more than a typical court would do. We don't know enough about the details, but if I was going to speculate and hazard a guess, I suspect that there was emergency relief that was sought from Judge Perry. She looked at that and is like, well, by the time she was actually ready to rule on that, it had already happened, and it was more appropriate for her to have factual development and actually issue an order once she had the opportunity to have an actual hearing on the facts, since there was no emergency technically at that time. I think that's potentially how I would look at this without knowing more information. And, perhaps we'll see more from her in the coming days. And we are literally covering a matter that is ongoing right now.
Yeah. And I don't know that, um, Trump keeps trying to say that he's going to keep trying to send in troops until something sticks, and he's threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act. But again, if you don't have the factual basis to federalize the troops, then you're probably not going to have the factual basis to invoke the Insurrection Act. So I think, that's not like a loophole. That's like a higher bar. But I think it does give us a window into where they're hoping to take this. I do think also that we can't divorce all of these escalations from the discussion that we had last week with General Hertling, and the instructions that are being given to the troops by the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary, well, I'm going to call it the Secretary of Defense, his, self-proclaimed Secretary of War, that basically they don't have to deal with rules of engagement or worry about war crimes or whatever he was suggesting to them. So we can return to that in a second in our next segment, because it's going to circle back to some of those themes.
Yes, and unfortunately.
So Renato, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the military is also involved, as we have discussed briefly before, in this pattern of basically blowing up boats in international waters. And we have had, I think now, some intimations of what legal theory that they are working on. And I wanted to just kind of spell this out. I did an Ask Asha about this, and I we'll put that in the notes so that you have some background. But basically, the big picture is that they are trying to, I think, use the drone warfare playbook that we used in the War on Terror, and basically transplant it into the drug trafficking, drug cartel context. My guess is that then the next step will be to transplant it into an immigration context domestically. So, I think
wow.
Yeah. I mean, never say never. I think there are a lot of things that we imagine would never happen. But basically what we see is that there are these tweets that are being put out in addition to these videos of these boats being blown up. I think there's 4 at this point, where they are claiming, without providing any evidence, that the people on these boats are, quote unquote, designated terrorist organizations. And there was a letter that was later written to members of Congress that argued that the United States is in a non-international armed conflict with these drug cartels. And you might be wondering what that means. A non-international armed conflict is an armed conflict with a non-state actor. So, for example, when our war on terror with Al-Qaeda was a non-international armed conflict. It wasn't with another nation state. Mm-hmm. And what they are trying to get at there, again, is to draw this parallel, that they're basically saying these drug cartels are like Al-Qaeda. And therefore, as a result, and we've now designated them as terrorist organizations, and as a result, they are now legitimate military targets. There are so many things wrong with this logical sequence that it's almost hard to unpack, but that is where, that's the framework that they're trying to do, pass off as their legal reasoning.
Yes, and without getting into too much detail, what I will just say is, just to punctuate how much this matters for people. I mean, these are the drug trafficking organizations that have been investigated, prosecuted for many years using our ordinary means, and federal criminal justice system that, it hasn't been perfect. Obviously, it hasn't stopped drug trafficking, but it has worked, and certainly been in place for many years. And what we're literally talking about is, as you pointed out, people just being bombed from boats without any due process, being essentially attacked and killed in open waters without any process or any determination whatsoever, which is why I cringed when you said that in the immigration context. I don't know what that would look like, but would that mean them dropping bombs on people entering our borders? I mean,
it would actually. So remember that if we're in a non-international armed conflict, then no due process is required. These people become enemy combatants, and that's what they're arguing. They're saying these drug cartels are unlawful enemy combatants. That's what the Bush administration, how they classified these members of Al-Qaeda or alleged members of Al-Qaeda. Here's the problem for the Trump administration. So first of all, there's actually an international law definition for an armed group. There has to be a command structure. There has to be military organization. And most importantly, they have to be engaging in armed violence against the state. And whatever you think about drug trafficking and drug cartels, they are none of those. So they don't meet this definition of, of any kind of armed group that would qualify for a non-international armed conflict. But that's why that's where they're trying to go, so that they can just say, we've just designated these as military targets. Also, there's no self-defense justification. So even if that is happening under, even if they qualify for that under international law, as a matter of domestic law, the president can only act in a defensive capacity under his Article 2 Commander-in-Chief authority. Like, we have to be under imminent attack or have just been attacked. Okay, so think 9/11. After 9/11, there was probably a pretty, fairly large window for the Bush administration to, even without congressional authorization, be able to retaliate or go after Al-Qaeda. However, at some point, whether it's temporally, you get farther from the event or you're moving into other regions, et cetera, if you're starting to engage in offensive operations, you need congressional approval. And basically, there is none here. And in fact, the ranking members of the Senate Armed Forces Committee have sent a letter to the Trump administration saying, hey, can you please give us some information on the legal basis for this? And also, which organizations are these designated terrorist organizations? And this is suspicious, Renato, because designated terrorist organizations is not a thing. Foreign terrorist organizations are a thing. The fact that they keep calling it designated is why I'm suspicious of what these secret organizations they've designated are, because I think some of them could be domestic. And that is why I think that they do plan to transplant this domestically. Because theoretically, if it's a military target, they can target them anywhere.
Yes, I saw that same letter. I really find that interesting because you've mentioned this distinction before. I wasn't focused on it. So kudos to you for that, Asha. Very smart comment. I wonder if actually, instead of immigration, that their focus is going to be on quote unquote Antifa.
Yeah.
Because they seem to like calling that an organization, and that could be an excuse to bomb someone's house or something along those lines. I mean, that I think is a genuine concern, and it's why all of us should be paying attention. Right. That's why we should be paying attention to this. It's why it matters. I mean, it's easy to say, okay, well, we don't care about these people out in a boat in the middle of nowhere. You may not be focused on this for yourself. You may think, I've got bigger problems, right? I've got people in my city, troops in my city right now, understandably. But this should concern you because it could be a bomb that you don't even see the troop in the future.
Well, I've got even worse news for you.
Oh, great. What now?
So the other reporting that came out this week is that Michael Ellis, who was the deputy director of the CIA, basically made himself like the general counsel or the first assistant to the general counsel, like basically in a position to provide legal sign-off for the CIA's actions, like basically to provide legal sign-off for like his own decisions, which is problematic and a conflict of interest. Michael Ellis, by the way, has, I call him the Where's Waldo of, the Trump years, is that he kind of surfaces every now and then. He surfaced in the Ukraine impeachment thing because he tried to move the transcript of the conversation with President Zelensky onto a code word server so that nobody could access it or get it. He was involved in the pre-publication review. He inserted himself in the pre-publication review of Bolton's book outside of the normal channels. And now he has basically made himself the legal poobah of the CIA. And people are like, why is he doing that? Why does that matter? Because who else besides the military have been involved in drone strikes, Renato? Besides the DOD? The CIA. And the CIA is bound under different legal authorities than the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense has to follow the laws of armed conflict, and there's Article 2 authorities, there's war powers resolutions, reporting requirements. The CIA operates under an executive branch framework and a law that governs covert action. So covert action is any secret operation that is undertaken in order to affect the economic, political, or military, events in another country without revealing the U.S.'s role. So the U.S. has plausible deniability. This is the authority where the U.S. was engaging in coups and all this stuff in the 70s. And basically, this would allow the Trump administration to evade all these, legal arguments. The problem is that in order to sign off on a covert action, after Iran-Contra, Congress increased its oversight. And so what it requires is that the president has to make a written finding that the covert action is necessary to meet an important foreign policy goal of the United States. So my guess is the CIA is trying to come up with those findings and substantiate those findings. And then Michael Ellis will sign off on it, and the president can, sign off on it. And then they can basically still do these same drone strikes, just without having to deal with all these definitions of armed groups and all of this stuff. I guess the silver lining is that the CIA can't engage within the United States. So maybe, I don't know where that goes, but that's where I think this is happening. They're trying to operate on these two different planes of trying to figure out legal justification so that they can continue to do these military maneuvers.
What I find interesting, and I think we'll have to discuss this in a future episode, is the way in which the Trump administration still tries to play lip service, at least, to certain laws and try to fit what they're doing into existing legal frameworks. I think it's interesting. I think it's important, and it potentially gives us some minor hope that we have for the future.
I think the exact same thing. I was like, it is interesting that they are trying to come up with legal justifications. And I guess for that, maybe we should be, I wouldn't say grateful, but hopeful, as you said.
So, Asha, before we go, do you have some news for us?
I do. I'm writing a book.
Whoa!
Yeah, I just announced it.
Congratulations!
Thank you.
So what's the book about?
It's been in my head for a long time, and I finally was able to get it down on paper. I have amazing agents, and finally landed a publisher and an editor. So I'm very excited. It won't come out for a little while, but I'm excited for it. It's about resisting complicity. Wow.
That's really important right now, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating topic. And I'm looking at the idea of complicity across a lot of different contexts. So, corporate America, sports, entertainment, all of these different manifestations that we see, and kind of the predictable patterns that come up and the predictable kinds of people who keep showing up, and how we can identify them and not become them.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations. When can we see this in bookstores? When is it going to actually come out?
It's going to actually come out in, I think, the spring of 2028.
Oh my goodness. Well, we have some time.
Yeah.
And that's why in the meantime, we're going to keep going to your Substack and going to your office hours, and of course, listening to this podcast.
Please do. I will be teasing out the ideas and themes there.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.